Welcome to Awakened Motherhood, the podcast where mothers share their powerful stories of healing and empowerment. I am your host, Amanda Quick, best-selling author, TEDx speaker, and advocate. In each episode, we dive deep into the stories of mothers who have overcome adversity, found their fierce feminine power, and embraced transformative parenting. Whether you're a mother driven to fight for your children or someone with a story burning inside you, this podcast is for you. Together, we'll explore themes of resilience, self-trust, and healing from our traumatic experiences, all spotlighting the profound journeys of awakened mothers. Join us for a space of naked authenticity, deep inspiration, and genuine connection. Embrace the divine feminine and discover your own warrior mama within. Welcome to Awakened Motherhood, where your story is the spark for change. Welcome, everyone, back to another episode of Awakened Motherhood. I'm your host, Amanda Quick, and today I am so excited to introduce my guest, Sher Kruse. She is an author, leadership and negotiation coach, and a TEDx producer who helps leaders, teams, and organizers master resilience, influence, and the power of human connection. She has an upcoming book called Stoic Empathy, coming out in April of 2025, that introduces a groundbreaking framework that fuses Stoic resilience with deep emotional intelligence, giving readers practical tools to navigate high-pressure decisions, lead with confidence, and build meaningful relationships in business and life. I am really excited to dig in here because there's just even the couple of pieces I've shared a little bit. There's so much underneath that. And Sher, I'm so excited to welcome you.
Oh my
Thank
gosh.
you for being here.
As a mom of 4, I am absolutely thrilled to be on this podcast and maybe talk about how Stoic Empathy can be applied in the motherhood context, but also just, maybe share a tear or two with my fellow moms out there. I've got 4 kids,
Yes.
so it's
Oh, I only have 3, and I feel like that's a
you can't
lot.
say only and then say 3. I don't think those two things follow. By the way, I'm pretty sure they take what they can get. So if there's 1, they take 100%. If there's 2, they take 50 each. If there's 3, 33.33, and so on and so forth.
100. So, and they treat. They actually don't do all equal 33 every time. It's like, I need 90%, and you only get 5%. But then we got to trade.
But there's only so much of you to go around, and we spend so much of it on them. And it is, honestly and truly, it sounds trite to say, but it is a gift to be able to mother, particularly to be able to keep your children safe, free from harm. And when I say safe, I don't just mean physically. I mean also in terms of their education and in terms of their diet and in terms of all of these things. It's truly a privilege to be able to do that. And also, it is extremely exhausting. And I think that it is okay for moms to be able to acknowledge that.
100%. We are all about the realness here. And as beautiful as it is, there's also a lot of challenge. 100%.
My favorite real mothering comment actually comes from my mom, because I had twins and she had twins. But when she had twins, she also had me, and I was a toddler, and my twins were my first 2. And I had help, I had a very supportive partner. I had the resources to be able to afford daytime help while I went to work. And my mom didn't have any help. In fact, she lost her mom 2.5 months before the twins were born. And so she was grieving when the twins came. And I said to her when I had the twins, I said, "Oh my God, how did you do this?" And she just looked at me and she said, "I cry a lot."
I mean, it's so true. We don't what do you mean? We just do it, and we do it. Yeah, I love it. That is beautiful. That is beautiful.
Yes, so true. She's amazing. She's one of my favorite people of all time. I talk about my mom all the time.
I love that. I love that so much. I think as moms, we relate to our moms in just so many different ways.
Yeah, definitely.
On this show, I like to start at the beginning. I like people to kind of give a background where their story began. And, the beginning can be so many different layers, but wherever feels relevant to you, specifically on your journey, where do you feel like all of this started for you?
For me, it definitely started with my childhood in Iran. So I was born, and this is dating me now. I was born in 77. Just to put things in context, in case there are people in the Awakened Motherhood audience who aren't experts in Iranian history, just perfectly okay. The Iranian Revolution happened in 1979. And so I was about 2. And then the Iran-Iraq War started in 1980. About 1 million people died in that war, and there was 40 million people living in Iran at the time. So while we were, as the people of Iran, dealing with the immediate aftermath of a revolution that candidly betrayed everyone who had fought for it, we were also engaged in a very bloody war with lots of missile attacks inside civilian territories. So that was my childhood, and I grew up very much confused. I grew up trying very hard on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour, moment-to-moment basis to decipher what was true and what wasn't. And that's partly because I lived in a regime that had a very aggressive propaganda machine. It was partly because my parents didn't submit to the propaganda machine, so they tried to correct my understanding of things as much as they could, or at least as much as they understood it. And I had to constantly try to maneuver between the two. And then, of course, in certain contexts, I had to pretend that I was in agreement with the propaganda machine so that I could be safe and my family could be safe, but I was only a child. And
Right.
maneuvering that space was such a challenge, and it left such an imprint on who I am today. And by the way, I didn't always get it right. I sometimes got it wrong, and it's devastating to think back to those times. And and so that's where it all kind of started for me, I would say. Yeah.
Mm. Wow. I mean, I don't think many people can fully conceptualize unless you've lived that, what growing up in essentially a war environment is like. And, there are some subsets and, unfortunately that did grow up in that in various parts of the world. And, there's still war out today, but I'm curious, having to have this, I know what I'm supposed to say in this situation to be okay and safe, but I also don't know that it's untrue. I mean, that's got to be that's a lot for a child to be able to navigate.
It is.
That's like,
It is. It's a lot, and like I said, you're prone to making mistakes. And the other thing about that is, look, you don't have to be a child from a post-revolutionary war-torn country to pretend that things are different at home than they really are. This is, unfortunately, a reality for children everywhere. And, not all children, thankfully, but children everywhere. There's no geographical limitations to growing up with that type of confusion that arises, or even a confusion between what you want to be, what you think you are, and who you are being told you are by authority
mm,
figures in your life, whether they be your parents or your teachers or a coach, an athletics coach, and so I feel like a lot of us have experienced at least some aspect of what that's like growing up. And then the devastating impact that it has on our ability to know ourselves, right? And therefore try to be determinative of who we are on a daily basis.
yeah, I think that's a really, really great point. And I do think you're right there. A lot of people can relate to some type of installation, some type of
Hmm.
imprinting. In order to be successful, you must be, here's your checklist of things. And therefore, if you don't do it this way or you don't behave this way, what does that mean about you? And there's a lot of projection in society, especially on children
Yeah.
who are still trying to figure out what, how, and who they are in a lot of
Right.
ways.
Right.
And,
Heck, I'm still trying to figure it out. I'm most of the way there, maybe. Is
well, and we get a little bit more information, but I don't think we ever get to there's no answer really, but we think there's an answer. And,
Yeah.
I know I know there's an argument in many of the kind of more awakened, aware spiritual groups that like school in itself is that indoctrination in the way that we must show up and behave, and that originally school was designed to make factory workers in a sense, and so we literally go by the bell.
Sure.
And we must ask permission to go to the bathroom. I mean, there's so many pieces there, but truly there still is some type of installation in society. And I think that, while it was heightened for you in the specific situation that you grew up in, I'm curious kind of what that did for your psyche. What did you believe about who you were when who you were was so kind of unclear in a lot of ways?
Back when I was a kid, I left Iran when I was 11, so I can try to think back to pre-11. Candidly, I don't have a ton of memories. I actually have some memories that stand out, and I talk about them frequently because they're limited. But honestly, what I remember from pre-11 is retreating into the things I was certain of. And I still do that. If there's an uncertainty in my life, if I've come to a crossroads and I don't know which path is the best, I always retreat to what I know for a fact, right? And so when I was a kid, what I knew for a fact was I was loved. Or what I knew for a fact was I liked this kind of food. Or I loved art. Or whatever. I like to make people out of the apples in my auntie's garden by putting sticks in them to use as arms and legs. And but it could also be very profound, right? I am smart. There's something about that I sort of retreated comfortably into, and for some reason never questioned. But plenty of other things I questioned all the time, including whether I was good enough, whether I was smart enough, right, and all of those things. But I tried to retreat into what I knew and find comfort in that. And then what I did is I tried to read what I was supposed to be, which again, a lot of us are, whether, earlier you were talking about just the rules of school, right? A lot of us work very hard to be who we're supposed to be, what we're supposed to be, and rise to the expectations that are set for us. The consequences are a little bit different. If you're not who you're supposed to be, your family can go to jail and, suffer severe consequences, versus maybe you get detention that day. Those consequences are different, but the feeling is not that different. The feeling is the same as you try to figure out who you're supposed to be, and then you become that, right? And how good you are at that, how adaptive you are at that, makes you more likely to succeed in that particular society. And I would say the same thing goes for the corporate environment. In growing up in America and being 100%. In the corporate world as a woman.
100%. We have our performance reviews to check the boxes if we have done
check the box
according to expectations.
And when I first came out of law school 25 years ago, the boxes were very much more varied than they are now, much more conformist than they are now. I remember being specifically told no ethnic earrings, for example, when I first graduated, no ethnic earrings to court, or even no pants to court. Now, again, this was a quarter of a century ago. Again, I'm dating myself.
You have to be feminist in this way.
Yes, and conformist to this culture. No ending your sentences in an upward inflection. No, we need you to sound powerful, not unsure. So, and some of this advice is, by the way, it's excellent in the sense that it does, in fact, help you get forward in the world you have entered. It does nothing to shift that world to a different place, but it does help you survive in it. And I always say this, look, no judgment. If you got to conform to survive in the world that you're in, I don't judge you, whether you're a sex worker or a female minority trying to work it up the corporate ladder. I'm not in your shoes. I'm merely stating that this journey of being able to find our authentic selves and finding success along with power, along with authenticity and integrity, is excruciatingly difficult and often involves massive compromises, either to our authenticity or to our success, right? And so this is, for me, become a lifelong quest, because one of the things, and I don't know if the listeners know this about me, but I was a lawyer for 20 years and I worked for large international corporations, plural. And so a lot of what I had to do was figure out, what is it that the jury wants me to be? What is it that the judge wants me to be? How is it that I'm going to relate to this client or to this opposing counsel in the middle of this negotiation so I can win, right? Because I want to win, right? But I also want to be authentic to myself. And how do I incorporate that in? And so this has been my journey essentially from the time I was born all the way through my professional path of finding the control within myself and being able to kind of live that, coexist that with my understanding of the room. And that's why the book, Stoic Empathy, the empathic portions are the understanding in the room, right? Reading the room, understanding the room, knowing the room, sometimes, if it's appropriate, even feeling the room, although not always. And then the stoicism aspects are the emotional regulation aspects of how do I maintain the truth of myself in any given moment, as much as there is one truth, right? People could argue that who we are changes minute to minute, and that's okay too. But how can I maintain the truth of who I am in that moment and maintain control over it? And if I say something because it is to the benefit of the patient I am serving or the client I'm advocating for or myself, it is an intentional decision and not something I've done accidentally because I forgot who I was in that moment. And I performed an analysis and decided that this was worth it to me. And so I need to move forward that way in that sort of like intentional way. And then the same thing goes for mothering, of course, is how do I present myself as an authentic parent to my children while still controlling the situation as much as possible because they're vulnerable and they need me to keep control of the situation. So, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, you answered the next question I was going to ask anyway. It was kind of, how did this all come into this concept of Stoic Stoic empathy and the way that those kind of marry together. And as you were speaking, almost this like visual was forming in my mind, which sometimes happens with concepts and frameworks. My mind likes to build puzzles and understandings. And so it's almost this concept of, we, especially, I think women are known for a little bit more of our ability to feel, but men can do it too. In the way that we walk into a room and we can discern what's going on and we can discern how things are feeling. And you're kind of describing this concept of empathy where we're perceiving a lot of information. And I think a lot of people who go through especially big challenges in their lives on some level, we develop this skill as a survival mechanism. We need to be able to perceive and understand our environment. Yeah. We need to be able to know what the rules are when we walk in the room before anybody says so. Mm-hmm. And sometimes this becomes, from abusive childhoods because we need to know what's going on so we don't set somebody off, whatever the situation is. But we develop this ability to have empathy. And some people go on the really hyper end where they bring all of the things inside, and some people can just perceive it and look around it. And so you're kind of saying, like in a courtroom, for instance, this is the rules of engagement of the courtroom, or at your job, or in your family home, depending on where you are. But that the Stoicism piece is about understanding where you fit in the middle of this puzzle almost, and like how you need to move your puzzle piece around a little bit depending on what is happening in the environment, and make a conscious choice to present a certain direction or way, not disregarding yourself, but being conscious of how it will most support you to show up in this particular environment.
That's 100% accurate. So essentially, Stoicism, which, by the way, in a lot of ways is a misunderstood term. It really, again, it just means emotional regulation and control. It doesn't mean lack of emotional feeling. That is how I exert control over myself, including my attempt to be authentic to who I am. And then empathy is my influence over the room. And I can use both of those things in conjunction with one another to advance my most intimate relationships forward, such as the ones I have with my partner in life, or with my children, or with my parents, or with my best friends. Or I can use them to get out of being arrested by the morality police in Iran, which does not require me to form an emotional connection and it might in fact harm me to form an emotional connection to the guard with the gun in my face, shoving the gun in my face, right? And so that is the spectrum. And it's not a binary thing either. It's a spectrum, right? Because there's a million places in between where I need to maybe feel a little bit connected, or a lot connected, or not connected at all. And although I say this often, unless you're a complete psychopath, you can't, once you really start the work of trying to understand someone, you can't really entirely disconnect. And I'm using the word psychopath literally, right? I mean, it's almost impossible,
Yes.
but there's still this spectrum of involvement and engagement on an emotional level that you can have.
Yeah. And, truly, as I think about this concept, what's fascinating to me is some people would almost even look at this as like some level of manipulation, which on some level you are consciously choosing how to adjust yourself for your environment. Absolutely. Like on a literal definition, that is on some level, you're perceiving and making adjustments. That's not a negative connotation of manipulation, though. That's making a conscious choice to put a certain part of yourself or say a certain thing that is still true for you in a certain tone or context, etc. But what else I'm finding interesting is as I kind of look through like my story and my life, it's essentially what I did in a lot of ways to get out of certain situations is I read the room, the environment, the situation, and I went, okay, if this is what's happening and this is the outcome I need, what is the expectations of who I am, as well as who do I need to be for me, as well as, it's like this, almost this map that forms, right, of who you must show up while being in your authenticity to move the direction. And that is in my own legal battle with my ex-husband, but also in my job, in interviews, in so many components of my life, thinking about that. And I think some people, in a sense, maybe have more, I don't know, natural ability to do that. And other people, are probably looking forward to your book so they can get some of that understanding.
Yeah. Well, I got to say, Amanda, I really love your point about manipulation and I think it's going back to it for just a second, because the word manipulation, which I absolutely agree with you that it does resonate in a way, but that word has a connotation of malice. But if you think about the word influence, right? That word doesn't have a connotation of malice. And really, that's the way to think of it is, listen, I can't be in your daily interactions with the people you care about or don't care about, with your friends and your enemies, in order to tell you what to do in any given situation or what would be morally appropriate. Only you can be the judge of that. But you know what it is to manipulate with malice versus influence with meaningful intent. So, for example, let's say you are a trauma surgeon, right? And there is patient after patient being rolled into your OR with gunshot wounds and horrible, horrible things or you are a trauma counselor and you work in a refugee camp with victims of mass rape, or you are the ability to control your surroundings, to control your own emotions, to show up in a particular way in that OR or in that refugee camp. That is used to serve people who are vulnerable, and not to use people who are vulnerable, right? And the reason I really like that example is that it really, really demonstrates how really the same sort of skill set can be used for good as for evil, just like really anything else.
It's true.
Right?
It's true. It's the spectrum.
And listen, it's up to you, man, how you want to use this. I'm not going to be in your living room judging you. The book does have a large, substantial section dedicated to ethics. And I do help provide guidelines for readers and those practicing this to try to stay close to their own values as much as they can. But what I argue is if you're moving forward with empathy, if you're moving forward with understanding, there's always going to be a greater aspect of ethics in that interaction than there was without the understanding. And I would much rather intentionally influence someone I understand than to be completely unaware of what's going on with the person I'm sitting across from or sharing my life with, right? But I also need to know for a fact that there are some people in this world with whom I can relax and maybe be a little bit less aware and just be, right? If you're in the corporate world, if you're in a bad marriage, if you're encountering the morality police, if you're a trauma surgeon, it doesn't have to just be an aggressive, hostile situation, right? This is not a luxury that's available to you. Sometimes I would say, even as a parent, mothering my children, it is not a luxury that has been available to me. But it is a luxury. I recognize it. I am incredibly grateful for those moments. And I would hope that each of us can get really quite good at recognizing who these people are. And I'll tell you, in my life, there aren't that many. There aren't that many people that I can completely just relax around. And what I mean by that is also, listen, I like my body. I think I look great in a bikini. I'm not going to wear one to court when I'm advocating for my client because I need to control the way the judge thinks about me and what's appropriate for that situation. So I don't necessarily mean I'm going to be someone who I am not. I just mean I need to conform.
I love that example. I can't get it out of my head.
I mean, you know exactly. By the way, there's many a time in my life where I have not liked my body in a bikini. I've had a lot of kids, as I might have mentioned. So
I totally understand. And I really like your point about, coming back to the, we're speaking to moms here. And so I really like your point thinking about mothering and parenting and the ways that we read our children. And they don't always tell us the specifics, but we have a different type of intuitive connection to our children. They come through us. We are the portal which gives them life. And I know for me, when they were babies and infants, there was such a deep knowing and connection to them. I couldn't shut it off. I couldn't not know what was going on. And whether you feel that deeply or not, that was my experience. And I think a lot of moms especially maybe ignore that knowing or seek out validation for it, but it's there. We have this instinct with our children. And so it's almost like this activation for that empathy connection to another being, except this one can't speak yet. And then they get older and grow up. But we watch that, and our empathy connection with them grows because we give them a bigger space, and the energetic womb that they have come out of, but grows with them because they need more space. But we always still have this connection to them. We always still have this underlying knowing they're not telling me something. There's something going on with them. They're not feeling we know.
Right.
And the ways that we choose to consciously show up is connected to this, right? The way that what questions are okay to ask, what might set them off, where do they need distance or space, and where do they need a little more hard boundaries? And we might even not entirely know the answer to that, but we're having those thoughts and questions. And I feel like in a lot of ways, that's building this picture for ourselves how do we show up in our family? How do we show up for our kid? How do we show up as moms? We're the center in a lot of ways of the family.
Right.
And so we're kind of building that space.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious what your experience and thoughts are here.
I mean, listen, just as you're talking, I'm just loving everything you're saying. And I also really liked what you said about we might not always know where that space is. In fact, I would say most of the time, there might not even be an objective best space to be, right? Much less for us to be able to know what it is, right? And then also it changes as the kids grow up, and depending on the kid, depending on the independence of the kid, depending on the capabilities of the kid, depending on the desire of the kid to want to be independent or not, we need to release different things at different times, which sometimes we're willing to do, sometimes we're unwilling to do. And sometimes, as is the case with me, as I have 2 teenagers now, there's a conflict there between what they would like me to release, what I would like to release, and what I have to release, right? The conflict there.
Yes, my oldest will be 15 in almost a month. So
Yeah, and that's great. That's fine. That conflict is actually great because it helps you negotiate and maneuver your way through that
mhm,
line. And knowing that how much of me is going to be present in the decisions of this person's life, and how aware am I even going to be of their emotional state at any given time. It is different when
mhm,
they're 15 than when they're a newborn. And part of the reason for that
yes.
is their level of vulnerability has changed. They
Mhm,
they need
mhm.
us in a different way. They need us, of course. I actually firmly believe that my teenagers in a lot of ways even need me more than they did when they
I agree. They're actually way harder
were aware.
and they need more presence because they don't scream and cry when something's upset. They go pout and don't talk
Right.
to you.
And leave me alone. But don't really leave me alone. But I didn't say the second part of that.
Right. That's where that intuitive connection, that feeling and knowing comes
Mhm.
in. And then do I have the space? Is this the right time? That's where those other like conversations with yourself have to come
Yes,
in.
absolutely. Absolutely. I totally agree. And it's such a challenge to engage in that maneuver. And the more practiced you are at it, the better you will become. But,
Mhm,
as we were saying, like there are kids, we're always going to be connected to them in one way or another. We might not necessarily be connected to the salesperson that we have to haggle with at the rug store. I say this because I'm Persian. My mom is a rug salesman. I married a rug salesman. Like my whole Persian rugs, they're
your life is rugs.
know my rugs. Okay. Anyway, so if you're interacting with a rug salesman, especially one you don't plan to buy all your rugs from, this is one rug, one and done. I don't need to stay emotionally connected to you at all. But I
Right.
still want to be authentic and have integrity, right? And I still want to be able to live with myself. And so it's kind of finding that path. And the more you know yourself, the better you can
Mhm, mhm,
evaluate these
mhm,
relationships and decide where in the empathy spectrum you want to hit. And the more, not only do you know where you want to hit, but you are able to. Because there sure
mhm,
as heck have been times in my life where I wanted to be more emotionally distant from someone. I knew that it would be good for me if I then maybe even them, if I could distance myself,
mhm,
but I couldn't quite get there. I needed the practice in stoicism in order to get there. That's like, I have a friend who is a trauma counselor at a refugee camp, and she almost quit 2 or 3 times because she was having a hard
mhm,
time creating that separation between herself and the
mhm,
people she
mhm,
serves. Yeah.
mhm. Yeah, I think it's a really challenging place. We all have our triggers. We all have our things that we cannot shut off, and where places where we're still reactive, and places where we don't always like how we show up because there's something deeper underneath, and there's a lot of internal work and digging into why that is and what that means that you have to do before you can really build that separation,
Yeah.
before you can look at it objectively instead of emotionally.
Right.
And
Yeah.
for me, my most challenging time, I was in active PTSD. I was in the middle of a high conflict divorce, and I still was required to evaluate the situation and proceed carefully and cautiously and intentionally. And getting out of that was, I'm going to say, almost this activation in what we could and be capable of doing. But it did also require me to really shove a lot down in each moment because I could not react. That would have been detrimental.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying I was perfect. There were definitely times I got explosive. Of course there were. I'm human.
Right.
But at the same time, my ability to learn how to do it in the moment and then come out of it then allowed me the space to process and move
Right.
and shift and then look back with a different perspective. And I think that in a lot of ways, the value of having a framework like this is to be able to look back and go, okay, these are the places that I did this, and these are the places where I couldn't, and this is why. And so in order for me to move forward with more intentionality, I've got to look a little bit deeper here.
Yes, absolutely. And knowing you, Amanda, in the instances where you did make a mistake, that also helped you grow because you were able to acknowledge, okay, I reacted with explosive anger in this situation. Was I entitled? Yes. Did it help me?
Yep.
No. Did it help my kids? No. So I'm going to work harder next time. Does that mean I don't process the emotion? Does that mean I completely ignore the harm that I have suffered and pretend as though it didn't occur? Absolutely not. Right? It just means I have to deal with it in a way that is responsible to me, my life, and the people who are more vulnerable than me, which in the case of your divorce would be your children, right? And so so I always kind of think of it as a pool of water. And sometimes I can dive right in and swim like it's nobody's business. Other times I have to be really careful and just dip my foot in or dip my toe in a little bit. I either way have to acknowledge that the pool of water exists and not ignore it and understand that in order to reach my full potential, at some point, I'm going to have to get my head wet. And and I say this as someone who loves doing their hair and really doesn't like getting their hair wet. Sorry to mince metaphors here, but it's really true. But at some point, I'm going to have to get my hair wet, but I can potentially do it in a way that doesn't suck me in a vortex underwater and drown me in that moment, right? And maybe a couple of people I'm tethered to. So that's really the way I think about it. You can't pretend the pool isn't there. You can't pretend that you can be an actualized person without exposure to it. But what you can do is you can measure how much you step in it or at least try to be intentional so that if you dove right in, even if it was explosive, at least you did it intentionally, right? Sometimes I look at activists and, folks who maybe get arrested because I'm Iranian. So my people get arrested every other second for acts of defiance against the government. And if that is an intentional decision that you are making, you are out and you are protesting an unjust law and you are willing to face the consequences, you're aware of what that would mean for you, for your family, and you engage in it. I don't want to judge you because if I did, I'd have to judge every revolutionary in the world, right? And every freedom fighter, every free thinker, everyone who's ever challenged a law and gotten in trouble for it, right? Instead, what I'm saying, and that's, by the way, that's why I don't judge the parent who doesn't let their kid go out and protest in Iran. Speaking again as an Iranian, they're not ready for their kid to die. And so they will do whatever they can to stand in their way. And it's very, very difficult for me to point a finger at that. I wouldn't want my kid to die. It's not bad enough, right? And that's my decision to make for myself. Obviously, at a certain point, it's the kid's decision. So this is the point. It is, how do we engage in that level of control? How do we formulate that analysis? By giving ourselves that space between stimuli and response, so that we can actually have this space between stimuli and response to decide how we want to act and then act, right? And even if that space is super tiny, right, it exists. And even if there is external power dynamics also impacting that space, we're still in here. This is our willpower. This is our identity. This is our choices, right? Unless you completely submit to a determinist way of thinking. This is you in the middle right here. And you exist. And sometimes you have more freedom and sometimes you have less freedom. Sometimes you have a lot more freedom. Sometimes you have a lot less freedom. But your thoughts, your judgments, your emotions, those are almost entirely in your control.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Something I say to people who've been through challenges, and it's not your fault what has happened to you, but it is your responsibility to decide how you're going to respond and to get yourself out.
I love that.
And so we're not always in charge of what environment we are put in. We are not in charge of where we were born and to the way we were raised and those type of things. We're not always in complete control, even in a corporate environment. Yes, we could choose to quit, but maybe we still need the paycheck or et
Yeah.
cetera. We're not always in charge of that
Or
immediate.
listen, if you live in America, maybe your kid is sick and you need the health insurance. I mean,
100%.
so we
100%. There's so many stacks of
right,
things,
exactly.
right? There's so many stacks of things. And so I'm not here to say, oh, you've manifested your reality. And so therefore, you're it's all your fault for
Right.
this. I'm not ever going to say that to somebody, especially as somebody who's gone through immense trauma. I didn't choose to be in this situation. And yes, there were signs I ignored. Of course there were. And yet this was the situation that I was in. And in those moments, it wasn't that I needed to be, beating up on myself about all of that. And I didn't need to say, but what didn't serve me was to stay in victim of it either. And to say, oh, this is happening. There's nothing I can do. Right. That's kind of what you're saying when people totally submit to there's nothing that can be done. And I think a lot of people we spend time on that place because we don't feel like we have control of our environment. But what I hear you saying is that by bringing stoicism into the empathy, we're almost reminded of the power we have despite the environment. Because we can decide in that moment, who am I going to be? I'm in this room, whether I like it or not, but who am I going to be in this moment? And what can the person that I am do to move whichever direction is best for me? And maybe that's, so I need to swim in circles, or maybe that's I'm going this way and I just dive head first. In spite of the chaos, whatever it is, I'm going to do so intentionally and consciously.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree more. And understanding the difference between what you can control and what you can't control at any given moment, and understanding that every new moment is another chance to exert that influence over yourself and potentially over the room. So that over time, what you can control, right? Like Amanda, look at your life now, what you can control right now in your life, the external environmental circumstances, there's so much more in your power than there was a few years ago, right? And
I have so many
you
more
have
choices.
so many more choices
100%.
than you used to. And
Yes.
so, but you
Yes.
always had choices, even if it's limited to your emotions, your thoughts, your judgments, right? And then you can utilize that to slowly expand that dichotomy of control to be more in the favor of your control than it was before. Always coming back to what is it that I can do? Could be extremely limited. It could be a lot. But here's the thing. It can always be more. What is it that I can do? Right. And coming back to that, the Stoics tell this really great story of an archer. The story of the archer. Have you heard of the story of the archer?
I don't think I have.
Okay. So the story of the archer, and this is, back in the Stoicism era when people actually shot bow and arrow, right? So the idea is you could be an archer preparing for, an incredibly important competition, and you can practice and you can sharpen every single one of your arrows and make sure that they are straight, and you can strengthen your arms and choose your grip, and you can aim very, very carefully. You can do all those things, and all those things have an impact on where that arrow lands. Once you have released the arrow, it is no longer in your control where it is going to land, right? Because there could be massive amounts of external circumstances. A gust of wind comes out of nowhere. Someone else cheats. There's a divot in the target board that makes your arrow bend in a weird way. There's a lot of things once you have released that are out of your control, but up until the point of release, it is in your control. So that if we think about it from an interaction point of view, what person A does, not in my control. How I respond, in my control, right? Am I limited by all of what the persons around me do? Yes, of course, there's power dynamics in society. It would be absurd to ignore the fact that they exist, right? However, I'm still here. I'm part of that power dynamic. And I can exert my influence over myself and potentially over others if the circumstances enable me to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a beautiful analogy, and it really comes back to one of my core values, and we have so much more power than we acknowledge and recognize. And by even being aware of all of these data points in our environment is still giving us more power because we have the awareness to make the choice of how we want to exist inside that and how we want to show up, how we want to respond, and what that means for us. And so we are, in a sense, we really can only control ourselves as much as we want to. We really can only control ourselves, but we, to go back to we can influence our environment through the way that we control ourselves in a way that is supportive for ourselves, for our children, for families, and by extension, in some form, the world.
Beautiful. Beautiful. I don't know if that was your last question, but it's a gorgeous way to end the podcast.
It's a gorgeous way to end. Yes. My really last question is, where can people find you? I know the book is coming out in a month, and I expect this episode will drop here just shortly before that release. So I would love, is there a waiting list people can get on, or where will the book be? As well as, if you have any last words of wisdom that you'd like to share.
So, yes, thank you so much. Okay, so the book, which, by the way, I'm so excited about, I genuinely feel that it's the culmination of my life's effort. It comes out April 8th. It should be available everywhere. So feel free, if it makes your life a little bit easier and, you don't mind giving it to Bezos, click the button on the Amazon and it'll come. If you are dedicated to your local bookstore, please go to your local bookstore. If they don't have it in stock, ask them for it. They will order it for you. So it is available everywhere. There's also an audiobook that has 10 extra audio tracks with exercises and meditations that folks might want to try out.
Fun.
And then there's also a Kindle. And you can go to sherkruse.com, my impossible to pronounce and spell name. I tried to make it extremely difficult for everyone to find me. As one does when they write a book, and put yourself on the mailing list, and then you can be a part of the newsletter. And please follow me on social media. I'm primarily on Instagram and LinkedIn, although my teenagers tell me I need to get on TikTok. I'm not yet there. So follow me on Instagram, follow me on LinkedIn. I promise I do respond to every message I get on LinkedIn and Instagram. Just sometimes it takes me a couple of weeks to be able to respond based on the volume, but I do respond. So if you feel like you'd like to reach out, feel free to do that. And thank you so much, and keep practicing this material out there. And what I would tell you, last thoughts for the listeners, you all have done this, and you've all done this because you have all received traumatizing news or encountered a traumatizing situation while mothering your children, and found somehow this superhuman strength within you to control your reaction to protect your children, right? Whether it was throwing yourself in front of them, whether it was pushing them out of the way, or whether it was the mental, emotional, verbal version of those things. You've all been there. You've all done that. And that is how you know you are capable of this. And it is precisely your empathic understanding of the people around you that give you that superpower. And all I'm talking to you about right now is just taking that superpower that comes in those extreme circumstances, being able to evaluate it, understand it, and apply it in your everyday life so that you can gain that power in life as you move forward.
That's so beautifully said. I 100% agree. And great reminder to leave people with that we've all done this, and having the intentionality behind it in more moments only will serve us and our children and the ways that we are desiring to show up in the world.
Definitely.
Amazing. Well, I just thank you so much for the conversation, for the work that you're doing. It is honestly, as somebody who's given one TEDx talk, you're an inspiration, and absolutely, things that I aspire to do, you're out there doing. And so I really appreciate your time and energy and your words of wisdom.
The privilege is completely mine. And as your audience knows, it was a pleasure chatting with you because you are so freaking smart and so interesting to talk to. And the verbal volleys have been so fun during this podcast, and they're not always like that. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be on and interact with you. Thank you, Amanda.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And to all the listeners, I will see you in the next episode. Thank you for joining us on Awakened Motherhood. I hope today's episode inspired you and offered support for your journey. Remember, your story has the power to ignite change, and your resilience is a testament to your strength as a mother. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. Share it with other mothers who might benefit from our stories of empowerment and healing. I invite you to connect with me on social media platforms at Amanda Quick Healing, or visit my website, amandaquickhealing.com, for more information on other ways to work with me. Until next time, keep embracing your divine self and discovering your warrior mama within. Thank you for being part of Awakened Motherhood, where your story is the spark for change.